The distant whistle of the oncoming train pierced through the crisp Montana air as Lillian Armstrong frantically clutched her swaddled infant son closer to her chest, her breath visible in the cold dawn of October 1878. The blood from her wounded shoulder had soaked through her tattered dress, and she knew she couldn't run much farther. Her pursuers would catch up soon, and her baby innocent little Thomas would be in danger. Lillian had fled from a life she'd never asked for, married to a man who'd shown his true violent nature only after their wedding vows. Gerald Whittaker had powerful friends and a ruthless determination to bring back what he considered his property, his wife and child. But Lillian would rather die than let her son grow up with such a monster for a father. The train to Silveridge was her only hope. With the last of her strength, she stumbled toward the small station at the edge of Coyote Creek, a dusty outpost that had sprung up with the silver mines 20 miles north. The station was deserted at this early hour, the ticket booth still locked. The train wasn't due to stop here. It was a freight train that would thunder through without slowing. Lillian collapsed behind a water barrel, her vision blurring. The hoofbeats in the distance were getting louder. Gerald's men were coming. She looked down at her sleeping baby boy, his peaceful face unaware of the danger surrounding them. In that moment, she made the most heart-wrenching decision of her life. She placed a trembling kiss on her son's forehead and slipped her wedding ring into the blankets, along with the silver locket containing a tiny portrait of herself. With tears streaming down her face, she carefully placed the basket beside the tracks, tucked slightly under the station's wooden platform where it wouldn't be visible from the main road. "I will find you again, my sweet boy," she whispered. "This is not goodbye forever." With one last agonizing look at her baby, Lillian forced herself to her feet and ran toward the woods on the other side of the station, hoping to draw her pursuers away from her child. Her plan worked. Minutes later, 3 riders thundered past the station, following her trail of blood into the forest. An hour passed. The baby slept soundly, protected from the morning chill by the thick blankets. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the tracks when the sound of a lone horse approached the station. Blake Xavier pulled his chestnut mare to a stop outside the Coyote Creek station, dismounting with the fluid grace of a man who'd spent most of his life in the saddle. At 28, Blake had already lived several lifetimes, first as a ranch hand, then a cavalry scout during the last years of the Indian Wars, and now as a drifting cowboy making his way from job to job across the Montana Territory. He'd come to collect a package for his current employer, the owner of the Diamond Bar Ranch 10 miles south, expecting to wait for the afternoon passenger train. The morning freight wasn't scheduled to stop here, but sometimes the engineers would slow enough to toss off mail bags. Blake tied his horse to the hitching post and stretched his tall frame, his dark Stetson pulled low against the morning sun. The station was still closed, so he settled himself on the platform to wait, pulling out a piece of jerky from his saddlebag. That's when he heard a soft whimpering sound coming from beneath the platform edge. Frowning, Blake moved toward the noise, crouching down to peer into the shadows. His eyes widened at the sight of a wicker basket nestled against the wooden supports, partially covered by a blue blanket. The whimpering grew louder as Blake carefully reached for the basket, sliding it out from its hiding place. When he pulled back the blanket, he found himself staring into the face of an infant, no more than a few months old, beginning to stir from sleep. "Well, I'll be." Blake muttered, his weathered face softening as the baby blinked up at him with bright blue eyes. "Where did you come from, little fella?" The baby's face scrunched up, a cry building in his tiny chest. Without thinking, Blake lifted him gently from the basket, holding him close against his buckskin jacket. "Easy now," he said softly, the tenderness in his voice surprising even himself. The baby settled against him, tiny fingers clutching at his shirt. Blake searched the basket, finding a silver locket and a wedding ring wrapped in a handkerchief embroidered with the initials LA. There was no note, no explanation for why an infant had been left beside the train tracks. The distant rumble of the approaching freight train vibrated through the wooden platform. Blake looked around frantically, hoping to spot someone, the mother, perhaps watching from a distance. But there was only empty prairie stretching in 3 directions and dense forest in the 4th. The train was coming fast, its whistle blowing as it approached the small station. Blake gathered the baby more securely in one arm and grabbed the basket with the other, moving quickly away from the tracks. The ground shook as the massive locomotive thundered past, its cars rattling and clanking at full speed. "Someone meant for you to be found," Blake said to the baby, who was now fully awake and staring up at him with curious eyes. "But I don't think they meant for you to be run over." He bounced the child gently in his arms, an instinctive movement that seemed to calm them both. The sound of horses approaching from the direction of town made Blake turn. Sheriff Roy Daniels and his deputy were riding toward the station, dust kicking up behind them. "Xavier," the sheriff nodded as he dismounted. "What brings you to?" He stopped abruptly when he noticed the bundle in Blake's arms. "Where'd you get that, baby?" "Found him," Blake answered simply. "Someone left him here by the tracks in this basket." The sheriff frowned, pushing his hat back. "That's so? Anyone see who did it?" Blake shook his head. "Place was deserted when I got here about 15 minutes ago." The deputy, a young man named Miller, peered at the baby. "Looks well cared for, not abandoned long, I'd wager. We've been tracking some trouble," Sheriff Daniels said grimly. "Woman shot at the Whitaker Ranch last night, stole a horse and fled with her baby. Whitaker's got men out looking for her, says she's unstable, dangerous." Blake's grip on the baby tightened slightly. "This the Whitaker baby then?" The sheriff shrugged. "Could be. Gerald Whitaker's an important man around these parts, owns half the businesses in Silveridge. If that's his child, he'll want him back right away." Something cold settled in Blake's stomach. He'd met Gerald Whitaker once or twice, a hard man with cold eyes and a reputation for ruthlessness in business. The baby in his arms felt small and vulnerable. "I'll take him to Doc Patterson in town," Blake said. "Make sure he's all right, then we can sort out who he belongs to." The sheriff looked like he wanted to object, but finally nodded. "All right, Xavier, I know you're good for it. I'll send word to Whitaker that we may have found his son." He looked around the station. "We'll keep looking for the mother. If she's wounded, she can't have gone far." As the lawman mounted up, Blake carefully secured the basket to his saddle and wrapped the baby more snugly in his blanket. "Let's get you somewhere safe, little one," he murmured. The ride to Silveridge took over an hour at a gentle pace to avoid jostling the infant. The baby remained remarkably calm, watching Blake with solemn eyes or dozing against his chest. By the time the town's church steeple came into view, Blake felt an unexpected connection to the child. Whether he was Whitaker's son or not, something about finding him by those tracks felt important, like fate had arranged their meeting. Dr. James Patterson's house sat at the edge of Silveridge, a white clapboard building with a small sign indicating his medical practice. Blake dismounted carefully, the baby secure in one arm, and knocked on the front door. The doctor, a man in his 50s with kind eyes and a graying beard, opened the door himself. "Blake Xavier," he said with surprise. "And who's this?" "Found him at Coyote Creek Station," Blake explained, following the doctor inside. "Need to make sure he's healthy." In the doctor's examining room, Blake reluctantly handed over the infant. The baby's face scrunched up at the transfer, and he began to cry, the first real crying he'd done since Blake found him. "Seems to have taken a shine to you," Dr. Patterson observed as he gently examined the child. "He's about 3 months old, I'd say, healthy, well-nourished." He looked at Blake over his spectacles. "You say you found him by the train tracks." Blake nodded, explaining the circumstances and what the sheriff had told him about the woman from Whitaker's ranch. "Lillian Armstrong," the doctor said quietly. "That would be the LA on the handkerchief. She married Gerald Whitaker last year, came to me a few times with injuries she claimed were accidents." His expression darkened. "Never my place to say otherwise, but I had my suspicions." "You think she was running from him?" Blake asked. "I think a mother doesn't abandon her child unless she's desperate," Dr. Patterson replied. "The question is, what do we do now? Whitaker will be here soon enough to claim his son." Blake paced the small examination room, watching as the doctor wrapped the baby in a fresh blanket. What if? He began, then stopped himself. The idea forming in his mind was madness. What if what? the doctor prompted. What if I took him, just for a while, Blake said, until we can find out what happened to his mother? Dr. Patterson raised his eyebrows. You, a drifting cowboy. What do you know about caring for an infant? Not much, Blake admitted. But I've got a job at the Diamond Bar, steady work, a cabin to myself, and I don't think this little one should go back to Whitaker until we know the full story. The doctor considered this for a long moment. It would only be temporary, he said slowly, and perhaps safer than the alternatives, given what I know of Whitaker's temper. He picked up the baby and handed him back to Blake. You'll need supplies, milk, diapers, a proper cradle. I'll figure it out, Blake said, feeling the weight of the baby settle comfortably in his arms. His name is Thomas, the doctor said. I delivered him myself. Lillian called him Tommy. Blake looked down at the baby, who had quieted once again in his arms. Hello, Tommy, he said softly. Looks like we're going to be partners for a while. The doctor wrote out a list of supplies and instructions, then helped Blake secure a makeshift sling to carry the baby safely on horseback. I'll tell the sheriff you've taken the child to the Diamond Bar while we sort things out. Whitaker won't be happy, but even he won't argue with a doctor's orders for the baby's welfare. As Blake rode out of town toward the Diamond Bar ranch, he felt both terrified and strangely peaceful. The weight of the infant against his chest was unfamiliar, yet somehow right. He had no idea what he was getting himself into, but he knew one thing for certain: he would protect this child until he could be reunited with his mother, if she was still alive. The Diamond Bar Ranch sprawled across several thousand acres of prime Montana grazing land. Blake had been working there for just over a month, hired on for the fall roundup and winter preparations. The ranch owner, Margaret Donovan, was a widow who ran the operation with a firm hand but a fair one. Blake hoped she would understand his unusual predicament. He approached the main house with trepidation, Tommy sleeping peacefully in the sling against his chest. The ranch hands he passed stared openly, some chuckling, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Margaret Donovan was on the porch when he arrived, her gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, sharp eyes missing nothing. Mr. Xavier, she said dryly. I sent you for mail, not a baby, madam. Blake removed his hat. There's a situation I need to explain. To his surprise, after hearing his story, Mrs. Donovan's stern face softened. Whitaker, she spat the name. That man's reputation is well known to me. I met his wife once, a gentle soul. If she's fled from him, she had good reason. She peered at the sleeping infant. You say you found him by the tracks. Poor little Mike could have been killed when the train came through. Yes, madam, Blake agreed. I can't explain it, but I feel responsible for him now, at least until his mother is found. Mrs. Donovan straightened. Well then, you'll need help. The old foreman's cabin has a spare room. My late husband built a cradle for our son, it's in the attic. And Sarah in the kitchen can show you how to prepare milk for an infant. Her eyes crinkled slightly. It's been a long time since we had a baby at Diamond Bar. Might do us all some good. Relief flooded through Blake. Thank you, Mrs. Donovan. I'll still pull my weight around here. See that you do, she replied, but there was no sting in her words. And Blake, if Whitaker comes looking, he'll find that Diamond Bar looks after its own. The first night with Tommy was a revelation for Blake. The baby woke every few hours, hungry and fussy. Blake stumbled through feedings and diaper changes, guided by the hastily scribbled instructions from Dr. Patterson and advice from Sarah, the ranch's cook who had raised 5 children of her own. By morning, Blake was exhausted but oddly satisfied. He strapped Tommy to his chest and went about his chores, adapting his routine to accommodate the infant. The other ranch hands ribbed him good-naturedly, but many offered help or advice from their own experiences as fathers. 3 days later, Sheriff Daniels rode out to the Diamond Bar. Gerald Whitaker's raising hell in town, he told Blake. Says you kidnapped his son. He's threatening to bring charges. Blake stood his ground. Any word on the mother? The sheriff removed his hat, running a hand through thinning hair. That's the thing. We found blood trails leading into the forest from the station, but they disappeared at the river. No body, though. She could still be alive. Then I'm keeping Tommy until we know for sure, Blake said firmly. Sheriff Daniels nodded reluctantly. Dr. Patterson's backing you up, says the child should stay put for health reasons. and Mrs. Donovan's got enough influence to hold Whittaker off for now. But be careful, Xavier. Whittaker's not a man who takes kindly to being defied. Over the next few weeks, a rhythm developed. Blake would rise before dawn, feed Tommy, then strap him securely to his chest as he went about his ranch duties. The baby thrived, growing stronger every day, his blue eyes following Blake's movements with increasing awareness. Blake found himself talking to Tommy constantly about the horses, the weather, the mountains in the distance. At night, he would sit in the rocking chair Mrs. Donovan had sent over, telling the baby stories of his travels while Tommy clutched his finger with surprising strength. "Your mama is going to be so proud of you when she sees you again," Blake would whisper. "You're growing like a weed, getting stronger every day." He'd taken to wearing Lillian's locket around his neck, keeping it safe for when she returned. Sometimes at night, he would open it and show Tommy the tiny portrait inside. "That's your mama," he would say softly. "She loves you very much. She'll come back for you." But as October turned to November and the first snows dusted the mountains, doubt began to creep in. What if Lillian Armstrong never returned? What would happen to Tommy then? The answer came on a bitter cold morning in early December. Blake was in the stable, Tommy bundled against his chest, when 3 riders entered the ranch yard. Gerald Whittaker rode at their head, flanked by 2 men with hard faces and guns visible at their hips. Blake stepped deeper into the shadows of the stable, his heart pounding. He recognized one of the men as the deputy who'd been with the sheriff at the train station, Mrs. Donovan emerged from the main house, straight-backed and imposing despite her 60 years. "Mr. Whittaker," her voice carried across the yard. "To what do I owe this unwelcome visit?" "I've come for my son," Whittaker replied coldly. "I know Xavier's keeping him here. The charade has gone on long enough. Dr. Patterson has determined the child should not be moved," Mrs. Donovan replied evenly. Whittaker dismounted, his expensive coat flapping in the winter wind. "I have a court order, Mrs. Donovan, signed by Judge Miller yesterday. The child is legally mine, and I'm taking him home where he belongs." Blake felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. Tommy stirred against his chest, as if sensing his distress. "Show me this order," Mrs. Donovan demanded. As the confrontation continued in the yard, Blake slipped out the back of the stable. He couldn't give Tommy up not to a man like Whittaker. Every instinct told him to protect this child who had somehow become the center of his world in just a few weeks. He saddled his horse quickly, secured Tommy in the sling, and covered them both with a heavy blanket. Then he led the horse quietly along the back trail that would take them into the hills without passing through the main yard. Blake had no plan beyond getting Tommy away from Whittaker. Perhaps they could make it to the next town, or even cross into Idaho territory. He had some savings, enough to start somewhere new. He rode hard for several hours, following game trails higher into the mountains where Whittaker's men would have trouble tracking them. Tommy remained remarkably quiet, lulled by the motion of the horse and the warmth of Blake's body. As dusk approached, Blake spotted a small cabin tucked against a rocky outcropping, smoke rising from its chimney. He approached cautiously, one hand on his revolver. A woman stepped out onto the porch, a rifle aimed steadily at his chest. "That's far enough," she called, her voice strong despite the obvious thinness of her frame. Blake reined his horse to a stop, his heart nearly stopping as the fading light revealed her features. Though gaunt and with hair shorn short, he recognized her from the portrait in the locket. "Lillian Armstrong," he asked incredulously. The rifle wavered. "Who wants to know?" Slowly, Blake opened his coat to reveal Tommy bundled against him. "I think I have someone who belongs to you." The rifle clattered to the porch as Lillian stumbled forward, her face transformed by desperate hope. "Tommy, my Tommy." Blake dismounted carefully, keeping the baby secure in his arms. He walked toward Lillian, who was now trembling visibly, tears streaming down her face. "He's been safe," Blake said gently, unwrapping the blanket so she could see her son's face. "I found him that day by the train tracks." Lillian reached out with shaking hands, taking her baby with a cry of joy that echoed through the mountains. She clutched Tommy to her chest, sobbing and laughing at once. The baby, recognizing his mother through some primal instinct, cooed and reached for her face. I never thought I'd see him again, she whispered, looking up at Blake with eyes swimming with tears. I was so weak from blood loss I thought I was dying. I left him there hoping someone would find him before. She couldn't finish the sentence. Come inside, she said finally. It's getting cold and you must be exhausted. You can tell me everything. The cabin was small but warm, a fire crackling in the stone fireplace. Lillian explained that it belonged to a trapper who'd saved her life, finding her half dead by the river and bringing her here to recover. The old man had gone to his winter camp 2 weeks ago, leaving her to regain her strength. I was planning to make my way to Oregon as soon as I was strong enough, she said, unable to take her eyes off Tommy, who was now sleeping peacefully in her arms. Start a new life where Gerald couldn't find me. I was going to search for Tommy once I was settled, but I feared. Her voice broke. Blake told her everything, finding Tommy, taking him to the Diamond Bar, caring for him these past weeks. He showed her the locket he'd been keeping safe. You've been wearing it, Lillian asked, touching the silver pendant now hanging around her neck once more. I wanted Tommy to see your face, Blake admitted. I told him stories about you every night so he wouldn't forget. Lillian's eyes filled with tears again. How can I ever thank you? No need for thanks, Blake said, but we have a problem. Whitaker's got a court order. He's looking for Tommy and he won't stop until he finds him. Lillian's face hardened. Gerald will never have my son. I'd rather die first. It won't come to that, Blake promised. But we need to leave Montana territory, tonight if possible. They made plans quickly. Blake would escort Lillian and Tommy to the nearest railroad station that bypassed Silveridge. From there, they could take a train west to Oregon or Washington territory. As they prepared to leave, Lillian suddenly turned to Blake. Why did you do all this? You could have handed Tommy over to the sheriff or to Gerald. It would have been easier. Blake considered the question carefully. When I found him there by those tracks, something changed in me. It was like I was meant to find him, to protect him. He looked at her directly. And to find you. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibility. Then Tommy stirred, breaking the spell. We should go, Lillian said softly, while we still have darkness to cover our tracks. They rode through the night, Blake leading the way through mountain passes he'd learned during his scouting days. Tommy, secured in a sling against his mother's chest, remained remarkably content, as if sensing the importance of their journey. By dawn, they had put considerable distance between themselves and the Diamond Bar. Blake estimated they could reach the small railroad stop at Eagle Pass by nightfall, where the westbound train would pass through shortly before midnight. They stopped to rest in a sheltered grove around midday. While Lillian nursed Tommy, Blake kept watch, scanning the horizon for any sign of pursuit. Tell me about yourself, Lillian said. You know my story, but I know nothing about the man who saved my son. Blake smiled faintly. Not much to tell, grew up on a small farm in Kansas. Left home at 16, worked ranches across the territories, did some scouting for the cavalry a few years back. Family, parents died in a fever outbreak when I was 18. No brothers or sisters, he shrugged. Been pretty much on my own since then. Lillian studied him thoughtfully. Until Tommy, Blake's expression softened. Until Tommy, he agreed. They continued their journey as the winter sun began its early descent. The weather held, but dark clouds on the western horizon promised snow before morning. They were within sight of Eagle Pass Station when disaster struck. The sound of hoofbeats behind them sent Blake's hand to his revolver. He turned to see 4 riders cresting the hill behind them, and his heart sank as he recognized Whitaker at their head. Keep going, he told Lillian urgently. Get to the station, I'll hold them off. Blake, no, she began. Go, he insisted. Tommy needs you. I'll catch up if I can. Tears in her eyes, Lillian spurred her horse forward, clutching Tommy tightly against her. Blake wheeled his mount around to face the oncoming riders, drawing his revolver. He took position behind a large boulder, hoping to create enough of a distraction to give Lillian time to reach the station. The sun was setting, the light fading quickly. That's far enough, Whitaker, Blake called as the riders approached. The men reined in their horses, spreading out in a loose semicircle. Whitaker's face was twisted with rage. Where's my son, Xavier? He demanded. Gone, Blake answered simply. Somewhere you'll never find him. With that whore who tried to steal him from me, Whitaker snarled. She's my wife. The boy is mine by law. A law that protects men like you instead of the women and children you hurt, Blake replied evenly. Lillian and Tommy deserve better. Shoot him, Whitaker ordered his men. He's a kidnapper and a thief. Blake ducked as the first shots rang out, returning fire from behind the boulder. He managed to hit one of Whitaker's men in the shoulder, sending him tumbling from his horse. But he was outnumbered, and soon bullets were chipping away at his cover. A shot grazed his arm, sending a flash of pain through his body. Blake knew he couldn't hold out much longer, but if he could just buy a few more minutes for Lillian and Tommy. Suddenly, new gunfire erupted from the direction of the station. Blake risked a glance and saw Sheriff Daniels and 3 other men riding toward them, rifles raised. "Drop your weapons," the sheriff shouted. All of you, Whitaker's men hesitated, looking to their employer for direction. Whitaker himself looked furious but calculating. "Sheriff," he called. "This man kidnapped my son. I have a court order. That court order's been rescinded," Sheriff Daniels interrupted, riding closer. "Judge Miller received some interesting evidence this morning, evidence of threats against your wife, of abuse witnessed by your own household staff." He looked grimly satisfied. Seems when folks thought Mrs. Whitaker was dead, they found the courage to speak up about what they'd seen. Blake slowly stood from behind the boulder, his revolver still trained on Whitaker. "Where's Lillian?" he asked the sheriff. "Safe at the station with her baby," Daniels replied. "Doc Patterson's with her. He rode out to find me as soon as he heard you'd fled the Diamond Bar. Said he couldn't stand by anymore while Whitaker abused his position." Whitaker's face contorted with rage. He suddenly spurred his horse forward, drawing his pistol and aiming directly at Blake. "You turned my wife against me," he snarled. "You stole my son." Multiple shots rang out from the sheriff, from his deputies, and from Blake. Whitaker jerked in his saddle, his pistol firing harmlessly into the air as he toppled to the ground. In the stillness that followed, Blake lowered his smoking revolver. Whitaker lay motionless in the dirt, blood spreading across his expensive coat. His remaining men raised their hands in surrender. "Is he?" Blake asked. Sheriff Daniels dismounted to check. "Dead," he confirmed, standing up again. "Can't say I'm sorry about it. The things his household staff revealed." He shook his head grimly. No man should treat a woman that way, especially not his wife. Blake holstered his weapon, suddenly aware of the burning pain in his arm where the bullet had grazed him. "Lillian and Tommy," he said. "I need to see them." "Let's get that arm looked at first," the sheriff said, but Blake was already mounting his horse. "It can wait," he said, turning toward the station where 2 lamps now glowed in the gathering darkness. At the Eagle Pass station, Blake found Lillian sitting inside with Tommy in her arms, Dr. Patterson hovering nearby. When she saw Blake enter, she gave a cry of relief and rose to her feet. "You're alive," she breathed. "When I heard the gunshots, I'm fine," he assured her, though his arm was throbbing painfully. "Whitaker's dead. It's over." Dr. Patterson immediately noticed Blake's wound and insisted on treating it. As the doctor cleaned and bandaged his arm, Blake explained everything that had happened. "What will you do now?" he asked Lillian when he'd finished his story. She looked down at Tommy, who was sleeping peacefully in her arms. "I don't know," she admitted. "I have no home, no family." "The Whitaker estate will likely pass to Tommy as his heir," Dr. Patterson pointed out. "With Gerald dead, you'd be the guardian of your son's inheritance until he comes of age." Lillian shook her head firmly. "I want nothing of Gerald's, nothing but our freedom." Blake hesitated, then spoke the words that had been forming in his heart since the moment he'd found her cabin in the mountains. "Come with me," he said quietly. "West to Oregon like you planned. I have savings. We could buy a small place, start fresh." Lillian looked up at him, surprised. "Why would you do that?" "Because in these few weeks with Tommy, I found something I never knew I was missing," Blake said honestly. "And when I found you too, it felt right somehow, like the 3 of us were meant to be together." He smiled self-consciously. "I know it sounds foolish." "No," Lillian said softly. "It doesn't sound foolish at all." The midnight train carried them west, away from Montana territory and the life that had nearly destroyed Lillian. She sat beside Blake in the nearly empty passenger car, Tommy sleeping peacefully in her arms. I never thanked you properly, she said, her voice barely audible above the rhythmic clacking of the train wheels. For finding him that day, for keeping him safe. Blake looked down at the sleeping infant, remembering that moment beside the tracks when he'd first lifted Tommy from the basket. I think he saved me as much as I saved him, he admitted. Lillian's free hand found his, their fingers intertwining. Perhaps we all saved each other. As the train carried them toward a new beginning, Blake thought about the strange twist of fate that had brought them together: a desperate mother, a baby in a basket, and a lonely cowboy who'd found his heart beside the train tracks. 1 year later, on a small homestead in Oregon's Willamette Valley, Lillian Xavier watched her husband building a fence while their son tottered around the yard on unsteady legs. The morning sun gilded Blake's dark hair as he straightened to wave at them, his smile visible even at a distance. Tommy squealed with delight, holding up his arms. Da, da. Yes, that's your da, Lillian agreed, her hand resting protectively over the slight swell of her belly where their second child was growing. Life had not been easy in this new place, but it had been good, full of hard work, honest living, and a love that had grown stronger with each passing day. As Blake approached, scooping Tommy up to swing him through the air, Lillian touched the silver locket that still hung around her neck. Inside now were 2 portraits, her own on one side, and Blake on the other, a complete family that had begun with a desperate act of love and a chance encounter beside the railroad tracks. My 2 favorite men, she said as Blake leaned down to kiss her. And my favorite woman, he replied. Though we might need to make room for another favorite soon, he added, gently touching her growing belly. Tommy patted Blake's cheek with a chubby hand. Da home, he declared with satisfaction. That's right, son, Blake agreed, his eyes meeting Lillian's with a depth of feeling that still took her breath away. We're all home, for good.